Hello, everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining me today for Nahant Marsh's edition of Breakfast Nature Club this February 2022. My name is Jimmy Weebler. I am a naturalist here at Nahant Marsh. And if you're not familiar with Nahant Marsh, we are a nonprofit center, a 305-acre wetland preserve and education center located in Southwest Davenport, where we do education, conservation, and research. And the first Friday of every month, we do a program called Breakfast Nature Club, where we talk about a different topic every month. And this month of February, we've got Valentine's Day coming. And so we thought it would be fun to do a presentation on the mating rituals of different types of animals. And so if you have any questions, please throw those in the chat box. This presentation is going to be recorded. And with that, let's get started. And so first off, what is a mating ritual? And a mating ritual, these are just procreative behaviors in animals. And so what animals are doing prior to, during, or after mating. And these procreative behaviors can involve social interactions where you have either one-on-one interactions, maybe it's a male and a female. You might have two-on-one interactions or large group interactions, such as when frogs breed, for example, in large groups. These behaviors involve mating choices, mate choices. And so this is where usually the female is going to be choosing a male based on his traits and certain characters about him. This also involves intrasexual competition for mates. And so intrasexual meaning within either the males or within the females competing for mates. And so usually these are males competing with each other for a female. But these behaviors also can include parental care, and I'll have a few examples here later to show you examples of different types of parental care that animals use, whether they're caring for their young or caring for their eggs, things of that nature. The evolution of mating behavior goes back a ways, and it was looked at before Darwin's time, but this goes back to Charles Darwin, who came up with the theory of sexual selection. And this theory basically states that male features, which could be physical features, physical traits, or their behavioral displays, such as courtship dances, songs, and things of that nature. Those arise from the female's preferences for those traits. And so what we're going to be talking about in this presentation are going to be those traits that arise in males or females during their mating rituals. Also talking about their behaviors that are displayed during the breeding season is either part of their courtship, their copulation, or their parental care. And so these all involve either vocal, auditory, visual, tactile, or chemical signals are involved in these mating rituals. And we'll have several examples of each of these things. And so jumping into it, first off, how do birds copulate? We're going to give several examples of bird mating rituals. And I would venture to guess that a lot of people don't, maybe a large percentage of people don't really understand like how birds mate. And it all has to do with a thing called the cloaca. And so we've got a graphic image here, so brace yourselves, but I'll show you what a cloaca looks like. And there we have it right on the bald eagle. And the cloaca is an exit hole for pretty much everything, or an entry hole if depending on the action. And so this is many species have cloacas. Birds have them, fish have them, reptiles, amphibians, and the cloaca serves as sort of a uni-hole for urination, defecation. Females lay their eggs out of their cloaca. This is where sperm deposition happens. And that's exactly what happens with birds. And so we have what's called cloacal kissing, where the male will rub his cloaca against the female's cloaca, and that's how they transfer sperm to the female, and that's how breeding occurs. And so can show you how that looks. Take a quick look at this video of pigeons, and we'll show you what cloacal kissing looks like. This is actual kissing, not the cloacal kissing part. That's coming up. there you have it, cloacal kiss, and that is how birds reproduce. And so let's talk about some more bird examples, mating rituals and birds. And we'll start off with one that I'm sure most folks will be familiar with. And so wild turkeys have a pretty elaborate mating ritual. And wild turkeys, they get into social hierarchies where the males do this and the female groups do this, but they get into these pecking orders where some males will have more dominance over other males. And male turkeys certainly have kind of competition with each other, intra-sexual competition with each other for the female mate. And so in order to breed, turkeys will, in the springtime, usually beginning about in March, turkeys will the hormones will start pumping and they'll get into breeding mode. They'll start puffing up their feathers and lifting their fan, showing off their fan. They'll strut around, spitting and purring, or spitting and drumming. The male turkeys do, rubbing their wings on the ground and sort of just showing off and doing a courtship display to attract that mate. And in the case of turkeys, size does matter. And so the females are looking at sizes of things such as the snood, which is the structure that you see or hanging over the turkey's beak right here. But they're also looking at things like beard size. And so beards are especially adapted feathers, ornamental feathers, if you will, that are hanging off the chest there of male turkeys. Sometimes females will have those beards, but usually it's the male that has those beards, and females can choose their mate based on some of those structures. And so we have a video here of what a male turkey courtship display looks like. So we'll take a look at that. It's heard a gobble in the background. So that's the male turkey trying to attract the female. That's a female turkey yelping. We've got a young male turkey here, a Jake with a very short beard on the front. This is a Tom, a mature male turkey, strutting and lifting his tail feathers up. We're dragging his wings on the ground, spitting and strutting. And so that's what the male turkey mating ritual looks like. Moving on to a different bird species, we have the Smith's longspur. And so Smith's longspurs are native to Iowa. They're a species that occurs here during migration months. And so we have a range map here showing where they exist different times of the year. The yellow means it's migration corridor. And so you can see our part of Iowa here. Smith's longspurs will migrate through here. They're not a common bird. They're more likely found at Cone Marsh, which is it's north of Columbus Junction from here. And they're related to the Lapland longspur, which is a more common longspur we have here in the wintertime. But Smith's longspurs are interesting because they have one of the highest copulation rates of any bird, and a female Smith's longspur can mate more than 350 times in a week. And so they're what we call polygynandrous. And so this means each female pairs and copulates with 2 or 3 different males for a single clutch of eggs. At that same time, each male pair copulates with 2 or more females. And so in the case of Smith's longspurs, the males don't actually defend a territory, but instead they guard the females. They follow them closely around and compete for fertilizations. They frequently copulate in order to dilute or displace the sperm by other males. And so males are equipped to do this because their testes are actually double the mass of those of the monogamous Lapland longspur, which is the common one that we have here in Iowa. So I just think that's interesting. And I didn't mention before that the male Lapland or the male Smith's longspur is actually on top here in its breeding plumage, and the female is down here. And that's something common we see throughout the animal kingdom, is that the male is usually the more dramatic, the more colorful one, and the female is the more drab one of the species. And so that's because of that female preference, that sexual selection. Females are choosing the mate based on their breeding characteristics, such as plumage and things like that. Another species we have is the lark sparrow. And lark sparrows are native here to Iowa. I've got the range map here showing that they exist here during the breeding season, during the summer. And lark sparrows are cool. They're kind of like turkeys in that prior to actual mating, the males will strut around like a turkey. They'll stick their tail up. They'll show off these white spots they have on their tails. Their wings will droop to the ground. And before the male mounts the female, he will actually pick up a twig and he'll pass that on to the female just before they copulate. And then when it's complete, the female will fly off carrying that twig. And so again, this is the male on the top and the female is on the bottom here. So that's the lark sparrow. The brown-headed cowbird is another common species we have here in Iowa. The male is on the left here and the female is on the right. And I included these in this presentation just because I think cowbirds they have an interesting reproduction cycle, in that the cowbirds are parasites and that they lay their eggs in the nests of other species, and the other species will then raise those eggs for the brown-headed cowbird. And so it's been recorded that brown-headed cowbirds have parasitized 144 of 220 different species in whose nests that they've laid their eggs in. And so they can lay their eggs in a wide variety of different species. They do have preference for some species over others, but they can lay their eggs in a variety of different species nests. And they're actually the only wild passerine. So passerine being a perching bird, they're the only wild passerine ever reported to not show regression in their ovaries and their oviducts, these reproductive structures of the female, following their clutch completion. And they're basically like passerine chickens, some people describe them as, because they can always breed throughout the summer. And they make use of that adaptation that they have for being able to lay their eggs in other species' nests. They don't have to use the energy to make their own nests. And so they can rely on other species to do that for them. And therefore they can breed, have a lot more clutches throughout the breeding season than some other species can. This is the barn owl, another native species to Iowa. We don't see these around the Quad Cities area. They are an endangered species in Iowa. And I included them here because they have an interesting relationship where they're normally monogamous. Most birds are, many species of birds are monogamous, but the barn owl can actually, quote unquote, get divorced. And that if the breeding's not working, for example, if there's only a few eggs laid or maybe many not surviving chicks that come from the clutch, then that may be grounds for these birds separating and not having that monogamous relationship. And so that usually happens about 25% of the time in barn owls. But barn owls also are pretty cool looking. They have a heart-shaped face, which I think is appropriate for Valentine's Day this month. These are birds of paradise. So we're switching over to an exotic species here. We don't have these in Iowa, but these are from New Guinea. So these are the birds of paradise. No two species looks alike. There's about 40 different species of them, but they're sort of famous for their mating rituals, their courtship displays. And I wanted to include them here because I think it's fascinating to watch how the males display to the females. We have a video here that'll show that.
In the great island of New Guinea, there are 42 different species of birds of paradise, each more bizarre than the last. This forest is so rich that nourishing food can be gathered very quickly. That leaves the male six-plumed bird of paradise with time to concentrate on other matters, like tidying up his display area.
All right, so that was the birds of paradise. I encourage folks to look online at other videos. Like I said, there's many species and they all have a different courtship display. Fascinating videos to watch, but we'll switch over to an insect here. So talking about moths. So imagine finding your love by scent only. And so moths, of course, are nocturnal. And so they don't really rely on visual cues to find their mates, but they rely on pheromones or scents to find their mates. And male moths will sometimes fly even up to miles following the scent of a prospective female. And that's why moths have these very large, elaborate antennae. The females don't quite have, their antennae don't look like this. It's the males that need these extra structures on their antenna to be able to catch those pheromones as they're tracking down a female. And they can track them down based on how many molecules of those pheromones are actually getting to their antennae in the air. And so basically, the closer they get to the female, the more their antennae are going to be encountering those molecules, and that tells them that they're getting closer to the female. And it really is a race to the female, because it's usually the first male that gets to the female is the one that wins the mate. And so it's really sort of a race. And you can imagine it being a challenging thing for a moth to sort of track down a female if it's, high winds or lots of rain and different weather events can sort of dilute those pheromones. And it can be a tricky thing for a moth to track down its mate. Switching over to talking about the sea slug here. So these actually aren't snails at all. They're snails, shellless snails. And so there's over 3,000 different species of these sea slugs. And most of them live in shallow tropical waters, but they can be found in many different marine environments across the globe. And they have an interesting mating display where they insert sharp objects into each other. And so I have a video that is sort of explain the breeding of the sea slug.
It's beautiful, isn't it? And delicate for something called a sea slug. That's what this tiny marine animal is called. What's unusual about it is that it has a mating behavior so extreme that it seems to be a scientific first. Cephopteron, that's the genus, is hermaphroditic. That means each slug has working male and female reproductive organs. But that's not strange for a sea slug. It's also common for these animals to inject fluid full of hormones into some other part of the partner's body during mating. But this creature stabs the other slug in the forehead with a needle-like stylet. Sea slugs don't really have foreheads, but that's the word scientists use, and it is in the neighborhood of the central nervous system. So scientists think that this may be an attempt to inject hormones right into the nervous system to force the other slug to lay as many eggs as possible. With sea slugs, the war between the sexes is kind of confusing since each is both. But their behavior is a clear reminder that throughout nature, when sexual reproduction is involved, there's a distinct male and female biological agenda, even if they're in the same body.
All right, so that was the sea slug. Moving on to a spider. These are called peacock spiders. We don't have them in Iowa. We find these in Australia, but they get their name from the colorful and iridescent markings that these spiders have on the upper part of their abdomen. And they use these color and markings to display in their ritualist courtship dances, where they basically shake and vibrate their booty to attract a mate. And so I've got a video of their mating dances here. And so put on your party hats and get ready to dance, because this one has some music behind it. All right, so that was the peacock spider. Moving on to mussels. Don't have a mating ritual really for mussels here, or at least not in the sense of a courtship dance or song or anything like that. But mussels do have an interesting reproductive strategy. It's unusual and complex, and it has to do with an obligatory stage as a parasite on a fish. And so when mussels lay their eggs, the female mussel will raise those eggs inside of her, and once they transform into larvae, they hatch into larvae, and those are called glochidia. And those glochidia need to complete their life cycle on the gills of a fish. And so mussels have different strategies depending on what species we're talking about, how to get those glochidia onto the gills of a fish. But once they are on the gills, those glochidia will grow up to become juvenile mussels, at which point they can be released from the gills and complete their life cycle, turn into adults. And so some species of mussels will just release their glochidia into the water, and they'll randomly become associated with fish gills as they swim by. But some species of mussels have special appendages where they're adapted to having appendages that look like a fish, which works as a fish lure to attract other fish to the mussel. And as the fish swim by and maybe try to eat this fish, that's when the mussel will release its glochidia attached to the gills of the fish, and the mussels can grow into juvenile mussels on the gills of the fish and before they can be released. Here's a picture of what the glochidia or mussel larvae would look like on the gills of a fish. And so speaking of fish, I wanted to show the example of cichlids. And so cichlids are extremely common fish, especially in the pet trade. There's over 1,900 different species of them, but they're all African and they're all endemic to the African Great Lakes. And so this species here, Cynotilapia afra, is endemic to one of those lakes, Lake Malawi in Africa. And cichlids are known for their variety of different colors and their charisma as pet fish. And the males can even get more colorful during their mating, but they also put on elaborate dances for their mates. And so I have a video here to show you of cichlid breeding and their courtship and mating dance. So that was the mating dance and ritual of the cichlid. And I also have a video here showing the parental care. Cichlids do an interesting thing where they do what's called mouth brooding, where they care for their young in their mouth, and have a video here to show what that looks like. right, so that was the cichlid and their mouth brooding technique. Moving on to frogs here. Frogs, of course, have their mating ritual where they attract a mate. The males will attract a female by calling. And of course, frogs get into large groups where males perform a chorus, and each of the males are giving off a mating call to attract a mate. And when a male finds a female, they get into a position called amplexus, and that's where the male attaches himself to the female. And in the case of most frogs, the way they actually have external fertilization. And so what that means is the male is actually, as the female is releasing her eggs into the water, the male is releasing sperm onto those eggs as they're going into the water. And so that's called external fertilization. And that's the case for most frog species. But looking at some different froggy styles here. So frogs have different types of amplexus, and we have different positions here. So straddling, and the male is always on top here. The male is the darker shaded frog. We've got the axillary position. So this is probably the most common, axillary meaning armpit, and where the males will grab underneath or on top of the armpits there. Got the glued position, the cloacal opposition position, cephalic meaning head position, and the inguinal position. And so these are different types of amplexus. But the species of frogs that do internal fertilization are using this cloacal apposition position. And so most, like I said, most frogs are using this axillary position, but this just gives you an example of the different types of amplexus that frogs have as they're breeding. And so moving on to grasshoppers here, grasshoppers have many different species of grasshoppers will have a mating ritual where they will display certain traits about themselves. So this is usually a visual communication that they have, and they will showcase their bright species-specific colorations or markings in their courtship displays. They might do dances, they might do different types of calling, different flight displays. Some species have flashing those colors on their body parts and moving their antennae in certain ways as part of their mating ritual. In the case of grasshoppers, males will actually sometimes allow the females to feed on different parts of their bodies, for example, their wings or their legs or their glands. And of course, this isn't the only example of insects eating the female eating parts of the male. You might be familiar with the praying mantises, where females will actually eat the male praying mantis as a nourishing meal after copulation. But that does happen sometimes in grasshoppers as well. And so katydids and crickets, those rely more on sound and chemical cues instead of visual cues. Katydids and crickets are more nocturnal, and katydids and cicadas and things like that, those are the ones you hear making those noises, those calls in the summertime up in the trees. And so since they are breeding at night, they're going to be relying more on those sound and chemical cues versus the grasshopper's visual communication during their mating rituals. But I do have a video here of one species, a grasshopper, showing a courtship dance that the male is doing for the female. And he scares her off. All right, that was the grasshopper. Moving on to another type of insect, the giant water bug. We do have these at Nahant Marsh, and we've actually witnessed this parental care. Well, this is a rare example of paternal care of eggs. And normally it's not the male caring for the eggs, but in the case of giant water bugs, the male will brew the offspring on his back until they hatch, which can take about a month. And so these eggs, they need to remain moist. So they can't be laid on land, but they also need to have access to water. And so the male can make sure that happens by going up to the surface with these on his back, making sure those eggs get enough oxygen. And he also can protect them that way by being on his back. He can evade predators and protect his young that way. And here's a young giant water bug emerging from one of the eggs on the back of this giant water bug. All right, moving on to an example of a mammal. We've got the porcupine here, which we don't have in Iowa, but these are cool to talk about. They're nocturnal species, and they're very secretive, and so they're hard for scientists to actually study the mating behavior of porcupines because they're so secretive and nocturnal. And they're only fertile for about 8 to 12 hours out of the year, so very short window for breeding here. But the female will attract a male with her urine, have different molecules or chemicals in her urine to attract the mate, and the males will battle it out for the female. And so we're getting that intra-sexual competition here. And in the case of porcupine, size does matter. That usually the biggest and sexiest smelling male with large quills is going to be the one that wins the female over. But she gets to choose what mate she wants. And so how do porcupines make love? Very carefully. They've got those sharp quills, and they need to arrange them in such a way to be able to copulate. And so again, the female is choosing that mate. And when the female is ready and the male thinks that she's ready, he'll urinate on her. And if she doesn't like it, she'll scream and run away. But otherwise, if she is ready, they can mate. And so moving on to another type of mammal here, we've got giraffes. And giraffes the males will also fight for the female, and what's called doing something that's called bashing. And the males will actually bash their heads and necks together. And it can be a pretty aggressive and brutal thing that they do. But the males will also test the fertility of the females by tasting the urine, and there'll be certain hormones or chemicals in the urine, and that will tell the male that the female is ready to breed. And so I've got show a short clip of this video here of the courtship display of the giraffe. All right, that was the giraffe courtship display. Last but not least, we have the Atlantic puffin. Atlantic puffins is a bird species that lives along the Atlantic coast here. There are different types of puffins, some of which live on the West Coast, but this one lives here in the pink where it's permanent resident on the East Coast. And not a lot of people realize this. It's an unknown fact that puffins actually sound a lot like humans. And so I'll leave you with this video of the Atlantic puffin's mating dance. So hope you enjoy it.
The mating dance of the puffin is a subtle affair. To appreciate the complexity of these movements, one must enter the mind of the puffin, like so. Oh, hon, I meant to tell you, last night at Pete's I rolled a full house, right?
Oh.
And I decided to go for it, and I got a Yahtzee.
That's so brave, hon. I always keep the odd numbers. They feel so cozy.
Oh, hold on. This puffin got some stuffing for your puffin muffin.
You're so good at rhyming.
Yeah, it just kind of happened.
What are you looking at, hon?
I kind of felt a tingle.
I'll go get the laxatives.
It's different. It's like, this puffin got some stuffing for your puffin muffin.
Oh, I know what you need. You want to see some boobies?
What, like right now?
Sure, why not?
This booby kitty got a cute booty. Let's take it out like we're on a race of duty. This booby kitty got a cute booty. Let's take it out like we're on race of duty. Miss Puffin, got some stuffing for your puffin muffin. Just give me the beat now, you puffin freak. Miss Puffin, got some stuffing for your puffin muffin. Just give me the beat now, you puffin freak. This booty kitty got a cute booty. Let's take it off like we're on a race of duty. I wanna see boobies like we're in a B-movie. Alright. This booty kitty got a cute booty. Let's take it off like we're on a race of duty. I wanna see boobies like we're in a B-movie. Alright. This booty kitty got a cute booty. Let's take it off like we're on a race of duty. I wanna see boobies like we're in a B-movie. Alright. This booty kitty got a cute booty. Let's take it off like we're on a race of duty. I wanna see boobies like we're in a B-movie.
So do you, should we?
Yeah. Oh, that reminds me. I need socks and I need bin liners.
You mean to use while we're like,
Oh, yeah.
you puffin freak?
This booty kitty got a cute booty. The mating dance of
All right. Well, thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Again, this is Jimmy Weebler from Mayhem Marsh. If you are interested in seeing some more of our webinars or attending a Breakfast Nature Club in person, you can find out more about that at our website at mayhammarsh.org, shown there in the bottom right-hand corner. We also are on social media platforms, Facebook and Instagram, so I encourage folks to follow us, and we post all of our events on there, so you can check us out on there as well. So thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.